Day 4 of the 5-figure profit streak is a special one as it is New Year's Eve. A fun night on its own, but even better when I get the chance to teach a cocky kid a lesson he will never forget.
Alright, I'll go home. I'll let you beat me.
To get things started, I have ace 4 of diamonds and the button raises to $15. We 3-bet from the big blind to $65. My opponent makes a call and the flop comes jack 9-4, 2 diamonds. With a flush draw and a pair here being out of position, I should probably start with a check sometimes, but I think betting seems fine. I make it $75. My opponent makes a call and the turn comes the king of spades. This seems like as good a card as any to continue barreling. If I bet and my opponent folds, I'm happy. If they call, we still have a ton of equity. The only thing that would kind of suck is if we bet and they jam. I end up making it 180 and I'm not leaving much behind, so I would probably have to call off if they did jam. This is not the case, however, as my opponent folds. This was the best result. Next up, I have ace king off and we are only 6-handed and there is an under the gun limp for $5. We raise to $25 under the gun 1. The entire table seems to call as 4 people get in there, including the limper. The flop comes queen, jack, deuce, rainbow. The under the gun limper starts off by leading for $25. With a gut shot, 2 overs, and most importantly, the range advantage, I give this 0 respect. I think most of the time my opponent here will have basically nothing. I raise to $60. This works just as I drew it up as everyone ends up folding, including the guy who led. Next, I pick up ace king off's ugly cousin ace queen. I raise to $15 under the gun and the button and small blind make the call. We drill the flop as it comes queen 7-4. The small blind checks and I bet $25. The button folds, but the small blind raises to $100. They were only about $300 effective to start this hand, so we happily put them all in. They make the call and we see a run out that comes the king of hearts and the queen of hearts. We river trips, but not like we needed it, as my opponent says he missed his flush draw. Easy $600 pot comes my way. Next up, we are 6-handed and I have queen 10 off and raised to $15 on the button. Just a small blind makes a call and the flop comes jack 10-9. The small blind checks and we are pretty happy with middle pair and a straight draw. I bet $20 and my opponent makes a call. The turn comes the 8 of clubs. Our middle pair now improves to a straight and we don't even have to bet as my opponent takes a lead for $75. This is an overbet. Okay, I make the call. The river comes the queen of hearts. This is really annoying. Now there is a straight on board. I think my opponent would pretty much never check a king, so when they actually check, I decide to turn my hand now into a bluff. I bet way over pot, $500. Despite my opponent saying they did not believe me after the hand, they do end up snap folding. These kinds of bluffs are always nerve-wracking. Let's see if we can get this next one through as well. I have ace 5 of hearts, that's right, a very bluff-worthy hand, and there is an under the gun shuttle on for $10. UTG 1 raises to $20, that's a min raise, and I decide to 3-bet to $60 UTG 2. The small blind, however, has other plans as they 4-bet to $150. As expected, the original raiser folds, and action is on me. For what is nearly a min raise, I make the call. The flop comes king 8-6, 2 hearts. We flop very good for a 4-bet pot. My opponent starts off by betting $75. With a flush draw, I make the call. The turn comes the 10 of hearts. Turns out we don't need to bluff now, we have the nuts. My opponent slows down and checks. They have about $400 or a pot-sized bet left at this point. I could check back here, but I do decide to put in a bet for very small, $115. My opponent snap folds. I'm guessing they were just clicking buttons pre-flop and pretty much didn't have anything. Next up, I have ace jack off and there is an under the gun limp for $5. We raise to $25 under the gun 1. Just the big blind makes a call and the limper makes a fold. The flop comes king 8-6 with 2 spades. My opponent checks and I put in a c-bet for $20. They make the call and the turn comes the 10 of diamonds. This is where things get kind of weird as my opponent leads for $60. With a gut shot to the nuts, I don't think we can fold. I make the call. The river comes the 6 of spades. With the flush draw now completing, you'd think my opponent would slow down, but they don't. They continue and bet 165. I do have the ace of spades and we are very deep, so I certainly flirt with the idea of bluffing here. But then I remember I'm playing live poker and people don't like to fold, so I don't even try. I make the fold. In the next hand, I have ace 9 off, and there is an under the gun 1 and cutoff limp for $5. We raise to $30 on the button, and both my opponents make the call. The flop comes 9-5-3. We have top pair, and we are pretty happy. Action checks to me, and I bet $40. Just the early position player makes a call, and we see a turn that comes to 7 of hearts. This time, my opponent decides to lead for $75. With a flush draw on board and with top pair, top kicker, I think we should have the best hand here. I really don't want to give my opponent such cheap equity, so I decide to put in the raise here for $200. This backfires big time as they snap go all in for about $700. I did not expect this. They are saying they basically have a set. I make the quick fold. Next up, I have ace jack off, and there is an under the gun 1 and hijack limp for $5. I raise to $30 on the button, and both my opponents make the call. The flop comes pretty good, jack 10-5. Once again, some weird things start happening. The under the gun 1 player leads for $75. And the hijack calls. With top pair, top kicker on a pretty draw heavy board, I think I just want to put in a raise here. I make it $350. Just the under the gun 1 player makes a call. The turn comes to 9 of hearts. This is not a good card as 7-8 and the more likely king queen gets there. So when my opponent checks, I decide to pot control and check back. The river is also pretty bad. The queen of hearts. Now any 8 makes a straight as well as any king. My top pair has gone from pretty strong to pretty damn weak. Things get even more annoying as my opponent decides to bet $200 into about $865. They do have about $700 behind, and with the ace of hearts, I certainly did contemplate jamming as a bluff, but as I mentioned earlier, getting someone to fold is not always so easy. With the price I'm getting, I didn't think I could fold. I just make the call, and my opponent shows 10-5 of clubs. Sick hand as he just flops 2 pair and leads into me. Sometimes this type of hand just has to happen when you're playing with such crazy players. I get a chance for revenge with my ace 9 off that I lost with earlier, as I have it again in this next hand, and there is an under the gun and cutoff and small blind limp for $5. Sometimes I can just check in the big blind, but I decide to put in the squeeze for $50, and just the small blind makes a call. The flop comes ace 7-4. We flop top pair, but with a weak kicker. I could check back when my opponent checks to me, but I think it's pretty standard to just put in a c-bet here. I make it $40. My opponent has none of this, as they raise to $250. By itself, this is a huge check raise, but especially so when I only started the hand with about $450. This is pretty much half my stack. They are basically saying they have a stronger ace than me, maybe 2 pair, maybe even a set. Whether I call or fold here, I think is mainly pretty player dependent. If this guy was really tight, maybe I would just fold, but he wasn't really tight, so I do end up making the call. The turn comes at 8 of diamonds. I really have no clue what my opponent is doing, as now they decide to bet less, $100 into about $600. At this point, I'm kind of expecting to just lose all the time here, but when we call the 250, we can't really fold to the 100. I make the call. The river comes the king of hearts. At this point, there is over $800 in the pot, and we only have about $14 remaining. My opponent puts me all in with a $50 bet, and I make the call. I must say, I was dumbfounded when my opponent showed pocket jacks. That's right, pocket jacks. I couldn't tell you why he decided to raise the flop and turn this hand into a bluff. This hand made no sense. Next up, I have king 10 off and the hijack limps for $5. The small blind completes for $5, and we are in the big blind. Like last hand, I do sometimes just check here, but I decide to squeeze and I make it $35. The hijack makes a call, and we go to a flop that comes 9-5-5. Overall, a pretty good flop for my hand. I got 2 overs as well as a backdoor straight draw. I am definitely fine starting with a c-bet. I make it $30 into about 70. My opponent makes a call, and the turn comes the jack of hearts. Now with a gut shot as well as a card we block pretty heavily, such as king jack, 10 jack, we are certainly going to want to continue here. I put in another bet, this time big, 135 into about 130, and my opponent snap folds. At this point in the night, the clock has just struck past midnight, and it is officially 2023. Don't be mistaken, however, as hands are just starting to heat up. Next up, I have ace 10 off, and the low jack raises to $20. The hijack calls, and we call as well on the button. This would typically just be a fold in any normal game, and if I'm not going to fold, I should be 3-betting. but the people at my table were pretty big fish, so I felt pretty confident in playing this hand multi-way. Also, why wouldn't I play the hand when I know the flop is going to come ace 10 9? That's right, we flop top 2 pair. Action checks to the hijack, who bets $50. I might just call here for some opponents, but at this table I think it's best to just fast play my hands. I make it 150 and the other position player folds, but the hijack calls. The turn comes the 5 of clubs. With 360 in the pot, the small blind thinks about it strangely. They have some weird looks on their face, and then they say all in. My opponent has slightly more than me, over $840. Yes, I call. The river comes the king of spades, and my opponent shows ace deuce off. Wow, they just went berserk with a very weak top pair. And as a result, they are left with about $50, of which they just pick up and leave the table after the hand. Man, was that a New Year's gift. Next up, I have pocket jacks, and the hijack limps for $5. The small blind completes, and I raise to $45 from the big blind. This time, an appropriate squeeze. The hijack and small blind both call, and the flop comes 8-3-3. The small blind checks, and this is a pretty great flop for me. I put in a big bet. I make it $100. I like going big here as I get called by worse over pairs or any pair in general, like 8x, as well as diamond draws, as well as maybe even over cards like king queen or ace queen. Just the hijack makes a call, and the turn comes a 10 of spades. I decide to slow down here and check for some pot control, and my opponent checks back. The river comes a deuce of spades. I put in a pretty big bet for 250. My opponent thinks about it for a while but folds. This just seemed like a 2-street type of hand to go for value, but I don't know if I like my check on the turn. I probably should have just bet. Next up, I have 8-7 of hearts, and there is an under the gun limp for $5. The hijack raises to $25, and we call on the cutoff. The limper also makes a call. The flop comes king 7-3 with 1 heart. Action checks to the hijack, who makes it $30, and with a pair and backdoor hearts, I'm definitely calling, and the under the gun player makes a fold. The turn comes the 4 of hearts. We now have a flush draw to go along with my middle pair, and my opponent continues. They make it $50. Not too big of a size. I make the call. The river is kind of interesting. It comes a king of diamonds. My opponent has about $200 left, and they put in a bet for $50. Now, I certainly think my hand could definitely just be good by itself, but I really don't want to risk my opponent having a hand like pocket 8s, pocket 9s, pocket 10s, pocket jacks, pocket queens. All of these types of hands I think could certainly go for value on the river. I don't think they would necessarily bet the turn, but it's possible. For these reasons, I decide to turn my hand into a bluff and put my opponent all in. Thankfully, they do end up folding, and we take it down. In the next hand, I have ace 5 of hearts, and the under the gun player just rebought for $300, and they decide to straddle for $10. I raise to $30 under the gun 1, and the small blind and straddle make the call. The flop comes 7-7 deuce with 1 diamond. Action checks to me, and I put in a bet for $35, and just the small blind makes a call. The turn comes the 4 of spades. This time, my opponent leads for $40 into about 160. I don't think they're ever going to be doing this with a 7. I put them on a weaker hand, or maybe even a draw, so with a gut shot and ace high myself, which could actually be good, I decide to raise. I make it 150. My opponent makes a call, and the river comes a deuce of diamonds. With this run out, I don't think I can get my opponent to fold much. I check my ace high back, hoping it's good, and it is. Well, kind of. We are chopping, as my opponent shows ace 3 of spades. Turns out my read was pretty on point. I would have liked to see a jam from them on the turn. I think that would have been pretty sick. I obviously would have had to fold. Next up, I have king 10 off, and the hijack raises to $20. The cutoff, small blind make the call, and we call on the big blind. The flop comes pretty great. King 10 deuce. We flop top 2 pair. I start off by checking, and action checks over to the hijack, who bets small, $20. The small blind calls, and we are definitely going to bump it up. I make it 120. Unexpectedly, the hijack folds, and the small blind calls. The turn comes the ace of clubs. My opponent checks, and I bet about half pot, 160, and they make the fold. I get ace 6 off in this next hand, and we are only 6-handed. I raise to $15 in the hijack, and the cutoff, small blind, and big blind all make the call. The flop comes ace 3 deuce. Action checks to me, and I bet $30, and just the cutoff calls. The turn comes a queen of of clubs. This time I slow down with my weak ace and I check, and my opponent bets $40. I just make the call and the river comes the king of hearts. I check and my opponent bets $75. This is a pretty small bet into $200. Typically this would just be a call, but this specific opponent was very tight. Sometimes you just feel beat, and I just felt beat here. It's probably bad, but I decide to fold. Next up, I have a hand that we are always happy to play, 10-9 of spades. There is an under the gun 1 limp for $5, under the gun 2 and the button also limp, and we raise from the small blind to $40. Just the under the gun 1 player makes a call, and we see a flop that comes ace 9 6 2 spades. That is a pair plus a flush draw. We are very happy about this flop. My opponent only has about $300 to start this hand, so I am just going to want to get it in. The best way for me to get it in is just by betting big and then betting big on the turn. I bet $75 and my opponent makes a call. I was essentially going to get it in no matter what on the turn, but it makes it a lot easier when the turn comes to 4 of spades. My opponent has about 185 left, and we put them all in. They make the call, and assuming I have the best hand right now, I just show my hand right away. My opponent says he needs a spade and shows the king of spades. Luckily, it does not come, and the river is the 6 of clubs. Best guess is he had ace king. I recommend you guys do not limp call with this hand, just raise. We will run good and take this $600 pot down. In the next hand, I have ace 3 of hearts, and we are only 5-handed. The under the gun player limps for $5. Under the gun 2 raises to $20. I am in the big blind and I complete, and so does the under the gun player. We go 3 ways to a flop that comes 10-3-3. We flop trips, the best possible trips. Action checks over to the original raiser who makes it $25. I generally like to fast play here, but with the board being so dry with no flush draws, no straight draws, I do elect to just make the call, which I also like because it gives the under the gun player the chance to get in as well. They do not, however, as they make the fold, and the turn comes a 5 of hearts. I check and my opponent continues for $75 into about 125. Now with a flush draw on board and us being so deep, I certainly want to get more money in this pot. I check raise to 275. My opponent makes the call, and the river comes a 9 of spades. With about 675 in the pot, I think I want to go big, a polar size that says I'm either bluffing or I've got it. I make it $600. Unfortunately, my opponent quickly folds. The next hand is a very important one, as it is the start of some drama. A young kid is now at the table. He sat down to my direct left. I open the button with 9-4 of clubs to $15, and he makes the call in the small blind. The flop comes 8-7 deuce 2 hearts. This is a pretty bad flop for me with not much connectivity besides a backdoor straight draw. My opponent checks, and I do put in a c-bet for $20, hoping to just take it down. This is not the case. My opponent makes a call, and the turn comes a 6 of diamonds. My opponent checks, and this is one of those cards that we can continue on. I could also check back, but we are now open-ended, and I think my opponent plays a pretty wide range, so I don't think it could be too difficult to get him off of something pretty weak. I put in a slight overbet for $75. My opponent thinks it over and makes a call, and the river comes a 7 of diamonds. This is certainly not a good card for me. My opponent could have a 7. When my opponent checks to me, I could definitely just check back, but having clubs, I do unblock the flopped flush draw. So for this reason, I actually decide to put in a very small bet for $75 into about 220. This is designed basically to just get any hearts, which will probably have a higher card than a 9 to fold. It's also not too big of a risk for me. This does not work, however, as my opponent snap calls and shows 5 deuce of spades.
You win.
Certainly not a hand you really want to be playing out of position, and certainly not a great thing to just have spades. So after this hand is over, I actually go and eat some pizza and I come back to the table, and that is where the drama kind of starts. The young fella who just hero called me with bottom pair in a pretty small pot ends up saying, quote unquote, "That was a nice hand earlier." And I'm like, what do you mean? And he's like, "That was a nice hand earlier." I'm like, you're talking about the hand where you called me with bottom pair? Like, yeah, I guess. Like, why are you telling me that that's a nice hand? So he's like clearly needling me, right? I come back, he's clearly trying to needle me when I come back. He's like, "That was a nice hand earlier." I'm like, bro, you don't generally tell people that you beat them. When you beat them in a hand, you don't generally tell them that was a nice hand, right? Like, you don't tell that to someone, right? Like, what are you doing?
So this is kind of what I said, right? I was just like, what's happening here? I just kind of brushed it off. But I thought that was really weird.
Now that you have that for some context, this next hand is extra special. We are still 5-handed and I have ace 5 of spades in the small blind. The cutoff limps for $5 and I make it $30. The young needling kid to my left makes the call and the cutoff folds. The flop comes 5-4 deuce 2 spades. Wow, talk about drilling a flop. I am certainly not going to slow play versus this opponent, especially. I make it $50. They make the call and the turn comes the ace of clubs. My top pair flush draw has now improved to top 2 pair and a flush draw. This seems like a great thing on the surface, but it's actually really not, as now any 3 makes a straight. And with this opponent, we have to definitely assume a 3 can be in their range. For this reason, I slow down and I check, and my opponent actually checks back. The river is money, the 7 of spades. We now have the nut flush versus an unpredictable opponent. With 165 in the pot, I decide to go small, $50. I really want to give my opponent a lot of rope to hang himself and to make a big raise. And right on cue, he does. He raises to 150. Now, while this is not a huge raise by any means, we are just very happy for the betting action to be reopened. My opponent has about $1,000 more behind. Generally, I think my response to this raise would just be all in, but I think when I do that, I'm only getting worse flushes to call. Now, maybe you could say that's like the only possible hand my opponent could have. When my opponent does not bet the turn, I really cannot expect them to ever have a 3 for a straight. I wasn't sure. I could really put this guy on any 2 cards. With that said, I thought it was also totally possible for my opponent to have 2 pair of some kind, which I certainly could not guarantee they would call an all in. I play it safe in terms of really making sure I get called, and I raise to 575. My opponent calls before I can literally even get my raise into the pot.
Call. Raise. Is it call? Yeah. Call. Flush.
I show and of course win an over $1,300 pot versus this trash talker. He will later say he flopped it. I don't really know what that means. I guess he's saying he flopped a straight. 6-3? Let's find out for sure in this next hand, as it's officially time to send him packing. I raised to $15 under the gun with ace king of hearts, and he 3-bets me to $50 under the gun 1. Action folds back around to me, and at this point he only has about $200, so it's a pretty easy all in. He makes the call, and let's hear what he has to say.
Alright. I'll let you beat me. That hand, when you had ace 5 spades, I flopped a straight. Like the nut.
You flopped a straight?
Yeah. This is true.
As you heard there, my opponent does in fact confirm that he had 6-3 for the flopped nut straight. For him not to raise the flop or bet the turn, that is absolutely insane. But let's get back to this hand.
You have pair?
No. Do you?
The flop comes 8-4 deuce, the turn is a jack, and the river is a 9, and my opponent shows ace queen off. My hand holds up and things really come full circle. My opponent went from being so smug and proud that he called me with bottom pair to ending up losing his entire stack. In all seriousness, it's not like I have so many years on this quote kid, but I just don't think I would ever try to needle someone I didn't know as I described he did. We were in for $490 total and cashed out for $36.19, which is an over $3,000 profit. The highest score so far of the 5-figure streak. Be sure to subscribe as there is more to come.